Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to be continuing our Thomas Pynchon secondary literature review series, this time discussing Kathryn Hume's essay, Repetition and the Construction of Character in Gravity's Rainbow. Now, I've never read Hume before, but I've come across her work a lot kind of by accident through references in other works regarding Pynchon. And after reading her, it's very clear that she is one of the preeminent scholars in Pynchon studies. She clearly has a very wide grasp on the scholarship of this field, and as such, I think if you're trying to find some consistency in Gravity's Rainbow, this is a really good work to read, because what she's doing here is she's confronting the kind of reading that happens from self-identified postmodernists who understand Pynchon to also be a postmodernist, or as Cooper talked about in this very first lecture in this series, counter-realists. These people will tend to read Pynchon in a way that may sacrifice a sense of continuity that might actually be there. And Hume very carefully shows how Pynchon wants to ride this line between complete obscurity, ineffability, loss of signification, and this sense of being grounded in, for example, things like gravity and the earth, and these traditional mythological symbols, for example. So in this work, she tries to show some of the prevailing forms of repetition that occur in Gravity's Rainbow to give it some sort of constancy, to give it some messaging. She mentions that Gravity's Rainbow clearly shows, for example, Pynchon's lack of interest in individuality. Within his aesthetics of character, she writes, individual variations are trivial when compared to the overwhelming problems facing everybody in his fictive universe. And of course, this kind of acts as the malaise that coats Gravity's Rainbow, being succumbed to the forces of them, or they, with a capital T. Nevertheless, this they, which tends to remain fairly ineffable throughout Gravity's Rainbow, this is not the sole place that we have to land on. We can get some more concrete notions of symbolism. So in this essay, she's going to talk about 6 different types of repetition, each one exposing a character to an overlooked facet of reality, or to our means of organizing such reality. Detailing these 6 forms, she writes that the first 2, symbolic systems and the void, form an opposition. Symbol systems represent fundamental methods of ordering experience, whereas the void is that which cannot be ordered by such systems. The next 2, technology and science, and multiple realities, augment humanist Western reality at both ends of the spectrum, the rational and the non-rational. The last 2, activity as game and kindness, ask what human beings may be and what obligations we may have to them given the nature of reality as defined in the other repeated situations. Establishing non-destructive relationships with other people is a major part of Pynchon's solution to the problems he poses, a significant component in the message of his mythology. And I think that's really important, is Pynchon is always trying to find some saving grace. He even talks about the notion of grace, for example, that even after the hellscape that is the contemporary world goes up into flames, maybe there will be a last infinitesimal moment, such as we see at the end of Gravity's Rainbow, as the rocket is about to hit the Orpheus Theater. There may be a last moment for some sort of consolation, for some unique gesture that gets at a kindness that transcends beyond instrumentalization. So in the first section, she wants to talk about these repetitious notions of symbol systems. And she writes rather correctly that one of Pynchon's key projects is revealing the power inherent in letters or numbers. And this power oftentimes is going to become, because of course symbols symbolize other things, they can be metaphors or imagery for other things. You can have notions such as gravity or the quintuple zero that represents this V2 rocket come to represent a piece of technology which is going to maintain or create an autonomous existence for itself. It is going to go beyond the wills of those who created it, which of course, now that I'm thinking about it, has some very interesting theological connotations. Because, of course, part of the notion of free will in a lot of the Abrahamic religions is this ability to use the divine spark within to go beyond this sense of rote process and have some sort of individuality that is really separated from the divine being, which we don't see in certain religions that are more polytheistic or pantheistic, for example. Now, Hume mentions a couple of the different characters, the way that they use symbol systems. She mentions Chicherin, for example, who is a Soviet officer who realizes that the form taken by the letters used to transliterate the language of the Kyrgyz tribes, Cyrillic, Arabic, or Roman, will channel their relationship to the world. And I remember reading this section, Gravity's Rainbow. It was a really confusing one, but really intriguing too, because I'm very interested in the philosophy of language. There's this mysterious symbol occurring in this fictionalized Kyrgyz language of Kyrgyzstan, and this, of course, connects to this ineffable Kyrgyz light theme that we hear in Gravity's Rainbow. But there's this symbol, and they're not exactly sure how it's pronounced, but they're trying to systematize this Kyrgyz language so that it can be taught via the written script. And there's a lot of colonial ambition that goes behind this of what writing system are they going to use? Is it going to be Cyrillic, like Russian or Ukrainian? Is it going to be Arabic, like, like Arabic? Or is it going to be Roman numerals, like any of the Romance or Latin languages or anything like that? And this has profound implications for the way that they interact with the world, because it can influence their sense of autonomy since words have power, right? When it comes to labels of identity, this creates cultural divides between self and other. It creates groups which then battle it out, as we see with these various groups in Gravity's Rainbow, such as they, or the White Visitation, or the Schwarzkommando, or any of these groups. These get created. They don't necessarily come before any ordering measure which is going to turn them into a group as such. Hume mentions, for example, Franz Pöckler, who uses mathematical symbols. With numbers, he can try to tame the terror of exponential curves and reduce the universe to our feeble human capacity to assimilate it. And that's an important element throughout Pynchon, is these characters are trying to hold on to their symbol systems at the same time that they are being broken down. The very individuality of those systems are going away, as, for example, languages are splintering, or people groups are splintering across the zone as World War II comes to a close, and there is a new kind of neo-colonial race for the remnants of the Third Reich. She also mentions that Roger Mexico, who is this statistician who talks a lot about the Poisson distribution, which is basically this random distribution that is the distribution we see the V2 rockets landing at, because they weren't particularly accurate. They were basically random in their targeting within London, which was kind of part of the appeal for the Nazis was this appeal of the psychological warfare. And this really abstracts the citizens of London, turning them, instead of being individuals, it turns them into statistical abstractions. He mentions, or Hume mentions, so she mentions, that Roger Mexico can predict the rocket fall statistically, but not individually. So we can paint in these broad strokes with these symbol systems, but we can't actually get to some individual. I think of the Arabic word aql, which is like this fundamental sense of soul or self that sits at the core of oneself, and the aql transcends the body and whatnot. But of course, we can't really get to this, and we get a lot of reactionary narratives as well by the Nazis who claim that, we are preserving the aql of our race, that is the white race. And this is embodied by characters such as Blicero or Weissman. Now, Hume mentions that Slothrop's experience with verbal and numeric symbol systems is much more diffuse than those of the others, and it includes letters, words, numbers. He tangles, for example, with a number of different letters, such as the G in Imiplex G, this plastic that he's trying to figure out about that has something to do with a component of the V2, probably the Schwarzgerät. Also the D-wing and the stimulus X. So again, these isolated letters on their own, which seem to have some greater sense of significance. And Hume mentions a quote in which it's stated that Slothrop is, quote, word-smitten. She also mentions how, for example, the numbers and letters of equations about the V2 give him erections, and he's chasing this quintuple zero rocket. So these are all symbols or words which he is falling in love with. And of course, these words symbolize the death of his own race, which is part of the contradiction or the confusion or the chimera inherent in his sense of self, is from that famous quote that he may be falling in love, in sexual love, with his and his race's own death. But this has a much more deep significance, because this notion of being in love with words has further theological significance, in which the Word, that is, the Son in the Trinity, or Jesus, equals love, right? God is love. So there's this elevation of words to an almost divine level in which there is a lingua affinity, a love for language itself. And Pynchon uses the perversity of his narratives to sort of send us down rabbit holes that lead us to the kind of unfortunate doubling of the word that is love, in the form of the word that harbors death, destruction, diffusion, integration into systems of control. Hume writes, by confronting his characters with symbol systems, Pynchon makes them at least marginally aware of forces that control their lives. For most, however, awareness of primary symbol systems does not lead to decisive action, for few members of an advanced society would jettison the alphabet or numbers. However, if they recognize that they have been controlling others through these means, they try to repudiate such power. Roger Mexico admittedly uses alliterative words to manipulate the elect, but Pynchon appears to condone this because his prank is explosive, Dionysian, and self-consuming. The power could not readily be exercised over others, nor could Roger use it to overcome his present victims a second time. And this is kind of funny. This is an allusion to when Roger Mexico learns to wield these alliterative words in the middle of a dinner banquet, and he has this kind of anarchistic moment where he starts coming up with all these gross dishes like booger biscuits or mucus mayonnaise or abortion aspic or dandruff dressing. And him and the other characters start going down this rabbit hole of just suddenly, like, even people that weren't in on it just start shouting additions, and it's just this raucous. It's a really funny and really enjoyable moment. But it's one of these kind of ironically explosive moments that it's not a lasting gesture. That's why she says that this is not going to work twice. But nevertheless, it is being aware of these symbolic systems that confine one and learning how to use them in really creative ways that might give us some means of recognizing our state of being controlled and yet not being subsumed or consumed by it. Now, the void is obviously this great opposite of these symbol systems which provide us with order. The void is this ineffable yet very present sense of nothingness and consumption. You could think of this probably also as the rapid consumerism of contemporary society that goes along with, for example, motivating very predatory market techniques that thrive off of the exploitation of those in third world countries. This sort of mystical void, while it's really nice to pontificate about it, Pynchon tries to show that the real corollary to these kind of idealistic notions of the void, of, completely collapsing into the void and restarting anew, a true sense of rebirth with no antecedents, that is an ideal narrative with which we are sold in order to get us to ignore the very profound and real consequences and precedent that it will set. That it will, in fact, be its own kind of transtemporal moment with really unfortunate consequences. And that's what is interesting about reading Pynchon, and as I've gotten more into the secondary literature, realizing, or not really realizing, but I guess concretizing the sense in which Pynchon has a lot of humanist tendencies to him. He's markedly post-humanist in his domain. Of course, it's not just human entities that are of concern for Pynchon, but he is concerned with human identity amidst this transhuman modern domain. Hume writes that when exposed to various voids, characters become aware that quotidian reality is bounded, as are our symbol systems. At the limits, something else commences. By repeating exposure to the void as a means of unfolding characters, Pynchon explores the gap between our ordinary reality and what our imagination yearns for. All the unobtainable, missing centers shed light on the limitations of our symbol systems and the reality they tame. And I think that's why Pynchon takes such advantage of these themes of the void. Think about, for example, the zero and going beyond the zero. Is this sense of nullity is a good way to knock us down a notch on the totem pole, to get us off of our high horse of just touting these transcendent narratives, the likes of which the German populace succumbed to in the early 20th century under the guise or under the help of the Nazi regime. This is the sort of stuff that Pynchon wants to laugh at, and he does that through the very real threat of utter dissolution or destruction, and then within that, the possibility for tarrying in that. And then she mentions with regards to science and technology. Of course, I think technology is one of the most important things for Pynchon. He's really trying to talk about the ramifications of technology in Gravity's Rainbow, but it's definitely not the only. But Hume writes, and I think this is very intelligent, that the rocket's ubiquity marks Pynchon's concept of reality, for his is not just the humanist's world of character, education in past cultures, and moral choice. Reality is not something separate from human invention, but is itself created through our science and our other professional activities. The rocket may have peaceful applications in space exploration, but its powers as a weapon hold the foreground, and the various futuristic rocket cities are not utopias. And that's important. Talking about the ways in which the ideal or abstractions like language are not mere things. In fact, they can have just as much reality, if not more reality, than what we take to be reality. A good example, for example, is the lecture that I did last time in this series, this essay by Dana Medoro, in which I relate her writings to Fritz Lang's 1929 silent film Die Frau im Mond, The Woman in the Moon. And this is one of the chief kind of German films talking about this fantasizing about the rocket, about transcending above Earth, of going to the moon, of going to space, of all the great stuff that it can bring us. Because, for example, they're going to the moon because there's gold on the moon. And the design of the rocket in Die Frau im Mond actually had quite profound implications for the design of the V2 or the A4 rocket designed by von Braun. And also, we see that in Gravity's Rainbow, Gerhard von Goer, a filmmaker who Slothrop kind of ends up protecting at one point, he has been assigned to create a propaganda film. And that propaganda film, which itself is based off of Die Frau im Mond, actually reifies the Hereros going from Südwest Africa, in like Namibia and stuff like that, up to Germany, to the zone, to get this 00001 rocket. So the fiction that we create, that is a human invention, creates our reality. So there's this subtle inversion, but this very palpable and pernicious inversion in which the ideal actually engenders the real, but in a very pernicious way. Hume continues, by repeatedly showing his characters engaged in rocket-related work, Pynchon insists that we take our relationship with technology into account when defining humanity. Through the complicity of all these characters, Pynchon suggests that people are responsible on the individual as well as the national level for the developments of human and social reality. We create the world. We do not just live in it. And of course, this does not mean, obviously, that we artifice the world all of our own doing. No. Of course, there is this profoundly mystical and primordial power of the earth and the moon and the stars in Gravity's Rainbow, which we did not create, and which we in fact become victim to in the case of gravity, which creates the parabolic curve of the V2, which is Gravity's Rainbow, which causes us to be succumbed to our own ideals. So really, Pynchon is trying to find this point, this moment in which the ideal and the real that precedes the ideal come together in a simultaneous gesture. And the indeterminacy, but also the fatality that tends to occur at that juncture point. Next, Hume discusses the notion of multiple realities, which I think is one of the most prominent elements in Pynchon, and it can provide for some of the most enjoyable reading experiences. For example, I think of the passage near the end of Mason and Dixon, written in 1997, in which the characters throughout Mason and Dixon have been battling it out over the flat versus globular Earth model. But then it turns out that there's a third side which adheres to the notion that the Earth is in the shape of a torus, basically a donut. So it is a hollow Earth model. There is a hollow kind of like a toilet paper tube going through the middle of the Earth. And Mason and Dixon actually travel into this hollow part of the Earth inside, and they find another civilization in there. And it's a really striking image of Pynchon's notion of particularly lost worlds. And I suggest you watch my video on Brian McHale's essay, Pynchon's Postmodernism, for more on that. But Hume points out this notion of the other side. So not only do you have them or they, which is this sort of ambiguous signifier for this other world, which has very pernicious connotations, the other side, with a capital O and a capital S, has more of a mystical or religious or mythical kind of connotation to it. It's not in and of itself bad. It's the realm of, I don't know, angels or gnomes or giants or, any of these things. And maybe it's even the spiritual medium stuff that's going on where they're contacting the dead or whatever with the white visitation. All of this stuff kind of haunts them throughout, but it allows for the possibility of change. It allows for a juncture point, that point of indeterminacy I was talking about, where the ideal and our desires meet with the real and their ramifications. And Hume says that strangely, almost all the characters accept the remaking of their cosmic picture without hesitation once they have been exposed to some other plane of reality. She says that Pynchon is insisting through all the repetitions that non-rational and non-rationalizable forces of some sort are unavoidably part of life, and that we cannot begin to make sense of experience without taking this augmentation of material reality into account. Our assumptions about what makes a person or character must include responses to multiple realities. And I think that's very interesting because that connects with what Pynchon means for the reader's life. Because, as is very clear, if you've, for example, listened to any of these lectures, or if you've read Pynchon or read any secondary literature on him, he is trying to duplicate the sense of epistemic uncertainty and ontological uncertainty in his characters, in his reader as well. He's trying to use stylistic and formalistic qualities of the narrative in order to disjoint the reader, in order to affectively know what the characters are feeling. Instead of just having it described from a detached, omniscient narrator perspective, we actually go into these multiple realities with them. And I think that's a really transformative quality of Pynchon's prose, right? It is oftentimes non-rational or irrational. And this might be, traditionally levied against an author as some sort of insult, but I think for Pynchon, he would be happy, content, maybe he would chuckle a little bit, because I think that's one of the brilliant things about Pynchon is it resists totalization. And that is the name of the game for all multiplicity, is that multiplicity resists totalization. It steps beyond. Now, a lot of secondary literature that's talking about Pynchon is trying to find some sort of framework through which to understand his work. Maybe this is the framework of Kabbalah, or Gnostic Christianity, or esoteric, Hermetic philosophy, or, engineering discourses, or mathematics discourses, or kind of general historical fiction, or all of these different, even feminist readings, for example, or Marxist readings. They're all trying to come with their own perspective in order to try to get something out of Gravity's Rainbow. And I think those are good. For example, Donna Madoro's essay that I did last time was kind of markedly feminist in its tone, especially by the end of the essay, but in a very compelling way. But oftentimes this can lead critics to fragment Gravity's Rainbow and kind of throw their hands up and be like, well, ultimately, this is just kind of pulling a string out of this massive yarn ball, but it's not really connected in a way where it is going to give us an overarching narrative. And indeed, gravity's rainbow is going to resist any totalizing framework that you give it. You're going to get different perspectives which are all potentially viable from a Marxist or a feminist or a mathematics or a Gnostic reading of gravity's rainbow. But when it comes to trying to nail down one of these senses of repetition, which can be seen as genuinely there, not just ephemeral, is this mythological aspect. Hume writes, "The repeated appearances of supernatural beings and of them mark Pynchon's cosmos as mythological. Although the presences do not conform to any neat taxonomy, the fabric of this fictive reality has enough structure to challenge the notion that it merely reflects random fragmentation. Granted, it resists closure. The various elements do not fit the same puzzle, and in that sense remain fragments. But within the pieces, there are local orders, if not order with a capital O, the distinction is heights, and characters need to reach some sort of accommodation with this divided nature of existence." And that notion of accommodation is important because there is very much, we're going beyond strict truth or false binaries, and we're going into what kind of realities are livable, what can be accommodated by a living being. And if sometimes that is a fictive reality, these paranoiac realities, well, as it says in Gravity's Rainbow, there is something almost religious about paranoia, or something comforting about paranoia. But then, of course, you also have the anti-paranoid part of the cycle, which Slothrop goes down later in Gravity's Rainbow. Nevertheless, there is some sense of being okay with the world as long as it's accommodatable. And mythology does tend to be one of these really powerful, repetitious pieces of the puzzle, so to speak. Now, second to last, she's got this category of activity as game. There's a lot of arbitrary stuff that goes on in Gravity's Rainbow. And that doesn't mean that Pynchon penned it in an arbitrary manner. It means that he penned it deliberately in a way where we understand a lot of the arbitrary practices that we engage in. She mentions those goals and rules do not necessarily nurture the best interest of the characters themselves. So all the time they're playing around with, you could even think about this section with the Kyrgyz language as a language game in the Wittgensteinian sense, right? And Pynchon loves playing with this sense of arbitrariness, of even irony, of refusing to accept easy answers or some shallow win, as it's said by Enzian on page 662. And all the time, characters are struggling with their complicity and with their need for some kind of information. But this is, as she says, the game they play revolves about death and control. So this is a very fatalistic game. But of course, in a game, you're happy to play with the virtual, with the slightly less than real, with the fictional, with the fantastical, right? I'm really hearkened to Jean Baudrillard's Fatal Strategies, in which he's going to kind of talk about stuff like this. And nevertheless, it's not just a mere game. Because, as she says, this answer to the discovery that we are pawns is obviously two-edged. Learning not to fear death can also help resign us to serving their ends as cannon fodder. When life is a game, people are things. This is one of Pynchon's important insights, and that is a great way to put it. When life is a game, people are things, right? When it's a question of moving pawns, and you can reduce pawns to, for example, a sort of rule book of statistical averages of what you can expect and what kind of things you should procedurally be doing. When you turn it into this mechanized instrumental system, people become objectified, and the bareness of their objectivity leads them to be forced to not be able to stomach like these grand historical narratives anymore. Hume writes very perceptively, basically, Pynchon seems to favor withdraw to the extent possible upon recognizing the existence of them and their game. He gives us no hope of effective counteraction. Individual and improvised gestures, such as the alliterative menu, are possible, but concerted effort is not, because that would involve hierarchy and control. We can only abjure control and extend ourselves to do small kindnesses. And this is really important because it kind of fits in with Pynchon's life as a recluse, right? Favoring withdrawal from the system, because Pynchon worked at Boeing after getting his engineering degree from Cornell, a historically very difficult engineering program, as if they're not all pretty damn difficult. But after he does that, he goes and works for Boeing, and part of that, he's a creative writing person, kind of doing, I don't exactly know what he did there exactly, but he was an engineer. He knows a lot about science and math and whatnot, but he hated working for Boeing. He hated working for a corporation, and as soon as he got enough money from writing his books, he left and he became a recluse for the rest of his life up until today. He is still AWOL as far as we're concerned. And this really lines up with his countercultural kind of heritage, right? Of feigning hierarchical authoritarian systems. Think of like the May 68 riots, for example, in France, where nearly a quarter of the French population is actively engaged in May of 1968 in uprisings, in riots, in protests, in walk-ins, and all this different stuff, mainly over the authoritarian nature of the French schooling system at first, and then also the Vietnam War that the U.S. was engaged in and whatnot. But Pynchon is really trying to stress the importance of these kind of local co-ops, right? This is sort of anarchistic in essence, where only local solutions are possible, not universal ones, right? Because universal ones, they're going to be these grand narratives of modernism or romanticism. Think of like the Hegelian notion of history, guided by reason with a capital R. And this is going to necessitate the dialectical inversion of historical moments and sublation of these moments as they get contradicted and we progress more and more towards absolute spirit. It's the ultimate idealist conception of history. But this is going to be instrumentalized and romanticized by the Nazis precisely because it's an ideal system that can be transmuted to all sorts of different situations as is needed. So for Pynchon, action should prioritize discontinuities that open up new modes of experience and reality. For example, drug experimentation is very popular in the counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s, and thus of Pynchon. Local counterforces, but even that can be caveated, because a lot of these counterforces, such as the Argentinian anarchists, don't really add up to much. There's like spiritual experiences and stuff like that. These are all these local discontinuities, these sort of infinitesimal changes in the order of things in which things are beyond change. Things are beyond being contested, and for example, you think about that last delta T before the V2 annihilates the Orpheus Theater at the end of Gravity's Rainbow. This is this last discontinuity where time and causality goes away and there's nothing to inhibit this V2 from the path that it's on now. Hume sums up her argument thus far to say that by means of this series of repetitions, Pynchon exposes his characters and his readers to a cosmos that is far from value-free. they come to understand some of the ways in which cultures and people are controlled by symbol systems. They are also pressured to realize that symbol systems do not provide any ultimate meaning, because such systems are helpless when faced with the void, whether that void is radiant or merely empty. Nor do symbol systems appear adequate to encompass the multiple realities offered us in this text. Right? There's this notion of nothing is able to fully totalize multiplicity. Pynchon insists that we live in the pluriverse and may discover that titans or angels are observing our actions. For what purpose, we will never know. Words can acknowledge the presence of such forces, but cannot delve into their motives or assign a logic to their actions. And that's really interesting because we're moving away from, for example, when constructing characters, thinking about their motivations as their chief value as characters. For Pynchon, it's the character's ability to accommodate a new reality. So instead of this modernist fetishization of these really full characters, think about Stephen Dedalus or Leopold Bloom in James Joyce's Ulysses. Or I guess Stephen is also in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. These are really deep characters. I mean, think too about someone like Hamlet. These are really deep and nuanced characters with this deep internal life. But for Pynchon, life is constantly externalizing. It's constantly reifying and integrating itself into various systems, oftentimes using vocabulary that plays right back into that system, right? Vocabulary in the sense of the metaphor of like these are the tools used by these people trying to tarry in these realities. So there's no longer an obsession with the motives or the logic of the actions, but a more pragmatic turn towards our ability to accommodate these actions. And yet within this possibly kind of absurdist or nihilistic or depressing message, Hume mentions a sort of last possibility that stays in Pynchon's writing, which is for kindness. She writes that Pynchon associates love with mental bondage and control, but when it disintegrates, it leaves a capacity for kindness. The willingness to give something without expectation of a return is a move meaningless within a game, and hence it puts one outside game board relations with others. And that's interesting because considering that we're no longer obsessed with some prevailing logic, there is no love with a capital L. There's just all these little moments of kindness which are trying to sort of instantiate this notion of love, but they themselves are not going to be this romantic gesture that takes us beyond the real, per se. We're always going to be stuck in the real, right? And she rightly points out that this is going to connect to Pynchon's notion of characters because, as I mentioned, with this modernist notion of characters with deep concerns, deep motives, a logic for how they get through the world, it is rightly pointed out by a lot of these kind of postmodernist critics, for example, that traditional rounded characters would contradict the world vision of postmodernism. Characters with well-established selves are incompatible with deconstructive absent centers. But, Hume says, this is only half of the picture. Character is indeed irrelevant, and the individual is diminished in this book, in part by the magnitude of them and the supernatural powers who are presented in repeated situations. The paranoid and multiple nature of reality affects Pynchon's construction of fictional people. Instead of focusing on character, the darling of realist and modernist fiction, Pynchon focuses on humanity, a very different concept. If we grant Pynchon the mythological, supernatural, and fragmented nature of his cosmos, then we must ask how humanity is to operate within such a threatening world, how humanity is to survive in it. Through his repetitions, he both warns us of what we must take into account, symbols, science, other realities, and the like, and gives us his low-keyed suggestions for attitudes and behavior. And that's important because it makes me think of, for example, the American pragmatists, such as Pierce, for example, which I've done a lecture on recently, in which no longer are we concerned with capital T truth, but rather we are concerned with the extent to which our beliefs lead to coherent habits that allow us to confront and internalize and compartmentalize reality. So for Pynchon, there's this resurgence of primal cosmic collectivism that transcends the solidity and solitary nature of the individual through non-institutional acts. So this is a much more local, kind of grassroots, again, very countercultural way of thinking. She writes, regarding this middle position, which I spoke of near the beginning, that Pynchon seems to represent a middle position in which the old-fashioned material universe of science is undone by the unexpected presence of gods and angels. But these powers give us no new assurance, because their ontological status, in turn, shimmers uncertainly. He fragments the self, and we discover that our systems for ordering experience all lack a firm center. Such a postmodern cosmos may drive us to agree that conventional logic lacks any foundational quote-unquote reality, but people, however discentered Lacan may declare them to be, must blunder on in such a postmodern world, their emotions active, even though thinking has been rendered problematic. Pynchon's mode of constructing characters is addressed to the problems of such people. Now, as much as any time in the past, we need generalized thinking about what it means to be human and about the ordinary concern of how to survive, because we, too, live in the postmodern world. And this is exactly what the American pragmatists are trying to do. No longer are we concerned with reality so much as coherence, effectiveness, pragmatic basis, right? Pragmatism, this is where it comes from. As decentered as these absolute notions of truth or reality may be, nevertheless, we live in a system where we're trying to figure out what the system is. So we have to find axioms which are flexible enough, yet can carry us forth in some sort of chain of discovery per se. So that being said, I hope that this has been helpful in understanding this very informative, very interesting essay. I hope you'll agree. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I'd really appreciate it. That is it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.